Today's daf we're going to be learning a Sanhedrin daf Nun Gimel. It's the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with a quick review of, we have the Mishna, which talked about those who get strangulation. Then we saw a Braita, which basically talked about the adulterer and adulteress. How do we know, excuse me, how do we know that they get strangulation? And for that, we had Rabbi Yoshia and Rabbi Yonatan. Rabbi Yoshia said it's because we don't know. It just says mot yumat. We don't know how they get killed. And we always go with the least severe. And Rabbi Yonatan said it's not because it's the least severe. It's because anytime the Torah says mot yumat, we assume it's chenek. And then we brought Rabbi to explain why that is, because it says mita, and because it says mita also bidei shamayim, we have a gezeira shava, what's true for mita by the hands of God, which leaves no sign, anything on the body. Likewise, we'll assume that it's the same for mita, a regular stam mita in the Torah, which would be chenek, okay, which doesn't leave any sort of sign. Now we start with the top of our daf, and our daf is going to go through and raise some issues here. So Bishlam Rabbi Yonatan Kedekam Farish Rabbi Tama. So Rabbi Yonatan explained his reasoning very well. As Rabbi said, we have this gezeira shava, mita, mita. We're going to learn one from the other. Ela Rabbi Yoshia, mimaydi kachenek bolam. But what we're basically saying is, we know there's skila, we know there's streifa, we know there's hereg, because the Torah gives in different psukim the fact that these are types of deaths. But chenek is never mentioned anywhere in the Torah. So how do we get to it? So according to Rabbi Yonatan, it's easy because we get to it because we need a death that doesn't leave any sort of sign, any noticeable way of doing things. And also we have to assume it would have to be the lighter. So it's either hereg or something else. And it can't be hereg because hereg clearly leaves a sign. You know, someone gets stabbed with a sword, it'll be very noticeable. So, and there's a tear in the body, basically. So there must be a concept of chenek. But according to Rabbi Yoshia, how do we know there's chenek? He says it's the least severe. But how do we know that it's the least severe? How do we know it's even an option? We have in the Torah where it talks about all the other three. It never mentions strangulation in the Torah anywhere. So they say, Ema Saif, right? It could be Saif is the least, and there's only three. To which I'm a Rava, Arba Mito, Gemara, Gemira, Lehu. There's a tradition about the four Mito Beitin. Everybody knows there's four Mito Beitin. It's a passed on. Usually Gemara, Gemira, Le means it's a halacha Moshe Misina. It's one of those in between derived to Rabbanit, right? A very early tradition, and therefore everybody knows that, and that explains it. Now we have one other explanation to deal with, which is my lo mipnei sheikala. Why does Rabbi Yonatan say it's not because it's the least severe? It must be because ha'miflagei bepluta d'Rabbi Shimon v'Rabbanan. Between Rabbi Yonatan and Rabbi Yoshia must be about whether they hold by Rabbi Shimon or the rabbis, about whether saif, killing by sword, is the least, or chenek is the least. So Rabbi Yoshia obviously thinks chenek is the least severe, but Rabbi Yonatan must hold like Rabbi Shimon, who holds that saif is the least severe, which means that therefore you wouldn't get to chenek that way. You'd have to get to chenek the other way, which is the gezeira shava that they bring in the name of Rabbi. Amar le Rabbi Zera la Abaye. Now Rabbi Zera is going to ask Abaye the following question. And you might have thought this would have been after the next Mishnah, because the next Mishnah, which we're going to see later on our daf, is Elohena Niskalin. It's going to list a long list of people who get stoned. So Rabbi Zera says to Abaye, okay, now the source for getting stoned is in the Torah by the Oven Yedoni, okay, and it says there the words demaihem bam, it says mot yumat, and it says that they get killed by stoning. Okay, that's the pasuk by the Oven Yedoni. And they're assuming the Oven Yedoni, there it says all those three things. And they're now going to say, Shara niskalin delokti buskila. So what about all the other places? We're going to have a long list of people who get stoned. It doesn't say in the Torah they get stoned like it says by the Oven Yedoni. So degamre me Oven Yedoni. So all the other niskalim are clearly learned out from Oven Yedoni, where it says they get stoned. B'mai gemira. Okay, not all of them. We did see that said by some of the niskalim that they get stoned, but the majority of them are learned from the Oven Yedoni. B'mai gamre. From what words do we learn it? And we're going to see all the places where we're not going to see it inside. You'll have to take it as a given. You can look them all up if you want. We don't have time to do that in class, but all the psukim where it says all the people that we're going to list now in the Mishnah, if it doesn't mention stoning related to them, it says by them the words mot yumat or mot yumatu, and it says demaihem bam, which are the same words that appear in the Oven Yedoni. So what Rabbi Zera is asking Abaye now is b'mai gamre, b'mot yumatu gamre, or b'demaihem bam gamre. We're going to assume that we're making a gezeira shava comparison in the words between the Oven Yedoni, which are the people who bring up people from the dead, that kind of witchcraft. We're going to learn from there to the other cases. And like I said, all the places say mot yumatu and they say demaihem bam. So which one are we darshaning? Is it mot yumatu or is it demaihem bam? Amar le, Abaye answers, demaihem bam gamri. It's from the word demaihem that appears in all of them, demaihem bam. That's where we learn it from. Why? Mot yumtu gamre, demaihem lamali. Well, it's an interesting way of saying it, but if you learn it from mot yumatu, what was the point of the Torah adding the words demaihem bam? Ella, my. So therefore, what must it be? Demaihem gamre. So it must be, demaihem is the limud. From there we learn that you get stoned, because otherwise there would be no point for the words demaihem bam. Okay, well, now we're open with the question, well then what is mot yumatu coming to tell us? Mot yumatu lamali kedetanya. Oh, that we need for a different drasha. As it says in the following braita, mot yumat hamaker rotzeachu. Okay, the one who hits, who kills, is a murderer and will be killed. Ein li ela b'mita ktuva bo. Now, there, you get the death penalty, right? The specific one that's for that case. That happens to be hereg, by the sword. Now, how do you know if for some reason we don't have a sword? We can't do saif. How do you know you kill him by one of the other methods? Talmud lomar, mot yumat hamakeh mikol makom. Because it says mot yumat, the person will be killed, sounds like the person will be killed no matter what. In other words, you kill them any way you can. And that's what we need mot yumatu for, which is why in all these other places where it mentions stoning, that we learn from demaihem bam, it also says mot yumatu to teach that you can get killed in any way, that if for some reason they can't stone you, they do it some other way. There's a bit of a problem with this whole drasha. I'm just going to raise it as a side point, which is normally all you need to do is learn it once, and then it teaches you for all the other places in the Torah. And once it mentions it twice, or for sure 3 times, it means it's only in those places and not in anywhere else. Now here, mot yumatu appears a number of times, not just 1, 2, or 3, but even more times it appears in the Torah. And the question is this principle that we're learning, mot yumat, means anytime you have the death penalty, basically you can do it in any way, but if you can't do it in the way you're supposed to, we do it some other way. Or is it only all those instances where it says mot yumatu? Now, the normal way of darshaning would tell us, the rules would be only in those places. And in fact, there are some who say only in those places, but there's others who say this actually applies across the board. It's actually machlokat Tosfot and the Rambam, but that's just a point I'm putting to the side right now. So we had Rabbi Zera ask this question, is it from mot yumatu? Is it from demaihem bam? We say it's from demaihem bam, and mot yumatu is used for this other drasha of learning that you can kill in any way you need to if you don't have a choice. Amalei Rav Achami Difti the Ravina. Now comes Rav Achami Difti, and he wants to ask a question about this question that Rabbi Zera asked Abaye. And he says, Ibn mot yumatu gamre my kakashele. What was bothering? He's assuming that Rabbi Zera was bothered by something. And when he asked Abaye, do you learn from mot yumatu? Do you learn from demaihem bam? And then Abaye said demaihem bam, and then Rabbi Zera was silent. Like that satisfied him. But they seem to think that if he had said we learn it from mot yumatu and not demaihem bam, that would have bothered Rabbi Zera, and he would have questioned it. So the question is, why would he? Okay, so first of all, why they assume that is a good question, but they basically are raising that there would have been a problem had we said mot yumat, and we learned it from there. So now they're going to ask, what is that? What would it be? Even mot yumatu gamre ma'ika kashle. What would have been difficult? What would Rabbi Zera have questioned Abaye with if Abaye had come back and said, oh, we actually learned it from mot yumatu, that teaches us skila in all these cases. So now they're going to go through 3 possibilities, and they're going to reject the first 2 with an ilema. If you say that what he would have raised as a difficulty is this, no, that's not a difficulty. He wouldn't have raised it. And if you say the second one, also, no. The third one, that would have been a difficulty. So let's see. Ilema eshet ish kakashele. Now we started with saying the mot yumat appears by eshet ish, the noef and the noefet, right? Adulterer or adulteress. They get chenek. And it says mot yumat. So if we had learned this gezeira shava by mot yumat, every time it says mot yumat, that means skila, you might have questioned, right? Rabbi Zera would have said, but what about eshet ish? What, you're going to say she gets skila or he gets skila, the adulterer and the adulteress? Well, right? And then you would have said, this is all an ilema. If you would have said that if you learn it from Mot Yumat, maybe you would think that also the adulterers get strangulation. And let's keep reading what you would have thought. Maybe you would have learned it from Oven Yedoni, that Mala Halam Beskila, Avkam Beskila. Just like that stoning, this is also stoning. But there's no way you would have thought that the adulterers get stoned. Why is that? Because Mida Amar Rachmana Arusa Beskila, Michlal Denisua La Beskila. Well, the Torah specifically said by an Aram Murasa that she gets stoned. And because she gets stoned for committing adultery while she's a betrothed woman, it's clear there that she's a unique exception to the rule. She's also an ishadish that ends up in relations with a man, but her punishment is clearly stricter than everyone else's, and that's why she has a unique punishment of stoning. Well, if she has a unique punishment that the other adulteress doesn't have, then Michlal Denisu Alav Beskila, it would be obvious that you wouldn't learn Mot Yumat by the adulterer and adulteress that they get stoned because Naram Murasa gets stoned and she's a unique exception. So nobody would have thought that, so it can't be that. Now, before we get to the next possibility, which we're also going to reject, you have to realize that all these are the next one's going to be premised on this one, which is, at this point, it's clear that we have a Mot Yumat that means chenek, and we have a Mot Yumat that means stoning. Okay, so we have two Mot Yumats now, and we have multiple Mot Yumats. We have Oven Yedoni that says Mot Yumat, and we want to learn from there to all cases where it says Mot Yumat, but we already have one exception to the rule, which is the strangulation of the adulterer and the adulteress. So now the Gemara says, well, maybe you would have raised a difficulty from one who hits their mother and father. Now, one who hits their mother and father also gets strangulation, doesn't get stoning, but it also says they're Mot Yumat. So you have to remember, it's obvious to the Gemara who gets stoned, who gets strangulation. That's not a question. The question is just how do we learn it? So if you have Mot Yumat as the words from Ovi and Yodi that you're going to learn to all the other cases, then you should learn from there also to Makeh V'Imo. So here, let me just, sorry, I read too much. So maybe your question would have been, Makeh V'Imo, one who hits his parents, and draws blood. Okay, we're going to get into all the details later in the 10th chapter, but you might have learned that from Oven Yedoni and said they get stoned. Well, you wouldn't have said that because, again, what did I tell you? We have two possibilities, Mot Yumatu by Oven Yedoni and Mot Yumatu by the Eshet Ish, by the adultery case. So adultery we know is strangulation, and Oven Yedoni we know is stoning. So again, ignoring the demaihem bond, which is really in the end where we learn it, but assuming we don't learn it from there, then we're left with this case of Makeh V'Imo. Where do we learn it from? Do we learn it from Oven Yedoni, or do we learn it maybe from the adulterer? And if you had to pick one, what would you say? Well, if you want to say maybe we learn that they get stoned, and that would be the problem with Mot Yumatu, why basically Rabbi Yehuda didn't really think that it was going to be okay if we learned it from Mot Yumatu, which is why he asked the question. Well, ligmaru me'eshadish. You should learn it from eshadish. Why? Why is eshadish a better way to learn the case? Because we already just learned that what? If you have a choice of two deaths, you're going to give the lighter one if you don't know which one. So if we're not sure, do we learn from Oven Yedoni to get stoned, or do we learn it from the adultery case to get strangulation? Obviously, we're going to learn from strangulation. So basically, if we had learned from Oven Yedoni to all the other skila cases from the word Mot Yumatu, we still wouldn't have concluded that the adulterer gets stoned or the adulteress. We still wouldn't conclude that Makeh V'Imo doesn't get stoned. So then what would be the problem for Rabbi Yehuda? To which Amar Le, they explain this is the problem. Shar haniskalim gufayu kakashile. Remember, this was Rav Achimidifti asked Ravina. So Ravina answers. This is the answer. He says he was worried about all the other niskalim because once we establish this principle that, again, building on the last two. Number one, we have the adulterer who clearly gets strangulation. And it also says Mot Yumat. And then we learned that if we're not sure what to give you, what punishment, we're always going to give you the lighter one. So, Shar Niskalin Gufayu Kakashile. Basically, Rabbi Yehuda would have said, if Abai had answered him, Mot Yumat teaches you skila from the Oven Yedoni, he would have asked, what do you mean? Why are you learning skila from Oven Yedoni? If you're learning it from those words, why learn it from the more severe case? Learn it from the adultery case. And then all those cases, Rabbi Zera would say, shouldn't be in the niskalim. They shouldn't get stoned. They should actually get strangulation. And that was what was bothering Rabbi Zera as to why he asked the question. In the end, it doesn't matter. Because Abai answered the question, said it has to do with the words demaihem bam, which are uniquely only found in these cases and not anywhere else. And it's not found in the adultery case. It's not found in the makevi v'mo case. And that explains the distinction between them. Even though they all say mot yumat or mot yumatu, they will be killed, because anytime it says demaihem bam, their blood will be on them. That means strangulate. That means stoning. Okay, that's what we learned. Now we're getting to the Mishnah that we should have started with, really, which is Eluhen haniskalin. Okay, the reason this is in the previous Mishnah, I assume, was because it had to do with the chenek case that we were learning about, the adultery case. Eluhen haniskalin. These are the people who get stoned. Habala aim, one who sleeps with one's mother. We're going to have a long list here. Get ready. Al eshet ha'av, the wife of your father. So if she's not your mother, but she's the wife of your father, then, and you sleep, the man sleeps with her also. Ala kala, daughter-in-law, man who sleeps with his daughter-in-law. Ala zachor, someone who has homosexual relations. Ala be'ema, engages in bestiality. Ha'isha ha'mivi'at be'ema, not only a man who sleeps with an animal, but a woman who has relations with an animal. Hamigadef, one who curses God. Ha'over avodah zarah, one who worships idols. Hanotem mizaro lamolech, one who offers up his son to this idol. Ubal o v'yidoni, these are the people who bring up the dead, necromancers and through seance and things like that. Hamechalel et Shabbat, one who desecrates Shabbat. Hamekalel avivi imo, one who curses his mother and father, not hits his mother and father is strangulation. But one who curses a mother and father gets stoned. Habal na'ara murasa. Okay, also this is we saw the na'ara murasa and the one who engages in relations with a na'ara murasa. Okay, if she's a willing partner, then she also gets strangulation. She gets stoning. Mistake. These are all stoning. If I said it by accident the wrong way, they're all stoning. Hamesit, one who turns someone else away to worship idols. Remember, we learned that person, there's no rachamim for that person. We don't try to acquit them in any way. Hamediach, someone who also turns someone else away to worship idols. Hamechashef, this is someone who engages in sorcery. Okay, I just want to look up one thing. I just want to clarify. Right. Okay. The ovin yidoni, the differences between them we're going to get to later on. And the difference between the mediach, right. The mediach is someone who pulls away an entire city, like ir hanidachat. Okay, that's from mediach. So mesit is someone who pulls an individual to worship idols, and a mediach is someone who pulls a whole city to worship idols. And hamechashev, so that's we said engages in witchcraft. Ben sorero mored, this is a son who we're going to learn all about. We have most of a chapter dedicated, or a part of a chapter dedicated to Ben sorero mored, of this wayward child who starts doing all these things that are indicators of how bad they're going to be when they grow up. Haba al ha'em, one who sleeps with one's mother. Chaya'o. So that's it. That's the list. Period. Now we're going back to the first one. The first one was haba al ha'em, a man who sleeps with his mother. Haba al ha'em chayav aleh mishum em umishum eshetav. According to Tanakama, somebody sleeps with his mother, who's also his father's wife, is liable to. Now, what do you mean liable to? You're only going to get one death penalty. But if you don't get the death penalty because you did it, let's say accidentally, you didn't realize it was your mother. It would be hard to say, but let's just say. Or you didn't realize it was forbidden, or you didn't realize whatever you might not have realized. That's called shogeg. You bring a sacrifice. Well, if you did two sins in one act, you bring two sacrifices. So if one slept with one's mother, who's also one's father's wife, then you're liable too. Rabbi Yehuda omer, eno chayav ela mishuma ein bilvad. No, if it's your mother who's also your father's wife, you're liable, one, for the fact that you slept with your mother. It's not because you slept with your father's wife. That would be if it's only your father's wife. But if it's your father's wife and your mother, you're only liable one, and that's for your mother. We're going to see in the Gemara, the first thing we're going to see in the Gemara is that there's a different version of Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, but of what he said, and that he didn't really say this according to the other version, he said something else. We'll get there soon. Habal eshet av. We're going to have other cases where somebody's liable twice. And here I want you to notice, and the Gemara is going to point this out later, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't disagree here. Habal eshet av. If one sleeps with his father's wife, chayam mishum eshet av, umishum eshet ish. You're liable too. One, because she's married to your father, and one because she's a married woman. Married woman, you also get punished. So now you're going to get two punishments, two korban chatats again, because now even though eshet ish is a different penalty, right? You don't get stoned, you get strangulation, but still you're liable too. In the world of korbanot, sacrifices, sin offerings, you'd have to bring two sin offerings. Now, by the way, the mother who is married to the father is also eshet ish. And if, in fact, they were married at the time, then you would be liable, 3. Okay, the Mishna doesn't mention it. The Mishna, the commentaries say, must have been talking about a case where the father was already dead. If the father's dead, obviously she's not a married woman anymore. So then it would only be the 2. But if she was still married to the father, your mother's married to your father, then there's going to be 3. Now, this issue of your father's wife is going to be a problem, not the eshet ish part, but the father's wife is going to be a problem. You can't sleep with a woman your father slept with, even if your father was married to, even if your father's not married to her anymore because he's dead. Okay? So even after your father's death, you're still not allowed to have relations with her. Whether they were actually married or even if they were only betrothed, also. And the same thing with habal kalato. If someone sleeps with their daughter-in-law, chayav aleh mishum kalato umishum eshet ish. It's 2 things. Number 1, it's your daughter-in-law. Number 2, she's a betrothed. She was married to somebody else. Bein b'chayei beno bein lachar mitat beno. And again, this issue of kalato, not the eshet ish, but the issue of kalato is whether the son is alive, whether the son is no longer alive. Whether they were married or whether they were only betrothed, right? The assumption is if they were only betrothed, they never even have relations, and yet it's still forbidden for you to do this. And one can see why. Okay, Gemara starts off, like I said, with a different version of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishna said, if one sleeps with one's mother, who's also the father's wife, they're only obligated 1, just for the mother, not for the father's wife. But now the Braita says, Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Im lo hayta imo ru'uya la'aviv, eino chayav ela mishum ha'em bilvad. He actually said this whole thing about liable only once for the mother, as in a different case entirely. It's not a case where it was your mother who was also married to your father. No, that you'd actually be liable twice. But if the mother wasn't allowed to be married to the father, it was a forbidden relationship, then you'd only be liable for the mother, and we won't really call her your father's wife. Because the marriage was an inappropriate marriage, they shouldn't have gotten married in the first place. So now we're going to have to figure out what's he talking about. My eina ru'yala. What does it mean she can't marry him? For what reason? There's all sorts of gradations. You might remember. There's people who it's chiyuv karet, like a rayot that you'll get karet for, cut off by God. There's ones that are mito beitin, you'll get the death penalty if you sleep with them. And then there's ones that are chayve lavim. Okay, for example, chayve lavim, like a kohen to a divorcee. That's only a negative commandment. There's no karet or mitat beitin associated with that. So which one is he referring to? If it's the high level ones, the ones that you get death penalties for either in the hands of God or in the hands of man, well, that would mean that Rabbi Yehuda thinks that you're only going to be liable for the mother and not for the father's wife because there is no marriage. But the rabbis think, no, there is marriage. Now, nobody thinks there's marriage in this case. We learned in Kiddushin and in other Masechtot that also Yevamot and Ketubot, this came up, I believe in all those Masechtot, that if that's the case, Halele Kiddushin Begava. That's what we call Kiddushin, that in Kiddushin Tofsin. There is no Kiddushin there. They're not married, so you can't call her Eshet Av. He might say that's my wife, but she's not his wife for halachic reasons. No betrothal is valid in that case. So it can't be that the rabbis think that it's your Chayav Mishum Eshet Av also in that case. Ela Chayve Lavim, Rabbi Yehuda Savar Laki Rabbi Akiva, Da'amar Ein Kiddushin Tofsin B'Chayve Lavim. Well, when it comes to lavim, like a kohen and a divorcee, who are not allowed to get married to each other, but there's no death penalty. So Rabbi Akiva has a unique position. The rabbis assume, and that's what the rabbis here go by, yes, kiddushin or tofsin. It's a good marriage. It's not a good marriage. It's a marriage that is considered a marriage. A betrothal is betrothal. The marriage is marriage. But you did something forbidden, and there's all sorts of ramifications. The woman becomes a halala. The children are halalim. And there's all sorts of disqualifications now for the kahuna. There's all sorts of problems with that. But it's the betrothal is valid. And that's why rabbis say Eshet Av also. She's also the father's wife, even though she shouldn't have been married to him in the first place. But Rabbi Yehuda Savar like Rabbi Akiva, but Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Akiva, who says, Ein Kiddushin Tofsim in Chayve Lavim. Rabbi Akiva has this unique position that even in Chayve Lavim, there's no Kiddushin. And that's the machloket. And that's why you're not chayav mishum eshera. So there's a different version entirely for Rabbi Yehuda. Mativ Rav Oshaya. Rav Oshaya says, how could it be that Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Akiva? Look, we're going to see from the following source, he clearly doesn't. Isur mitzvah. So here's a Mishna in Yevamot. Isur mitzvah v'isur kedusha chotzov v'lo mityabmo. If somebody is married to a man, the man dies without children. The woman is supposed to fulfill the mitzvah of yibum. But what if the person who she's supposed to do yibum with right now, the brother of her deceased husband, is either forbidden to her because of isur mitzvah or because of isur kedusha, which we don't yet know what these are, but we're going to define them in a minute. Then they can't marry them, but they still have an obligation of yibum, so they can't do yibum, but they have to do chalitza, which is the undoing of the yibum, right? It's saying with the shoe, and we do this ceremony to say, I'm not doing yibum, okay? But it's the way of getting out of yibum if you can't do yibum, or if you don't want to do yibum. In this case, you can't do yibum because they're forbidden to each other. The woman with her brother-in-law, there's some forbidden thing here. So what is this? So let's see. Turning now to Amabed. Isur mitzvah is shniyot midivrei sofer. If on a rabbinic level, this is arayot, okay? There's all these arayot, learned about them way back, that are forbidden by Torah law. Then the rabbis came and said, you know what? This relative to that relative is forbidden by Torah law. We're going to forbid someone else that's close to this, but isn't really forbidden by the Torah, but we're going to forbid it because we call it shniyot. Okay, that means any rabbinic prohibition. So now we have a case where the woman's supposed to do yibum with the brother-in-law. By Torah law, she's supposed to marry him. The problem is that by rabbinic law, she's not allowed to marry him. So what do? We do an in-between. She still has the Torah obligation of yibum, but we don't let her fulfill it through yibum. She fulfills it through doing chalitza, which is undoing the connection between them. Amai karilu isur mitzvah. Now, why are shniot midivrei sofrim called, right, isurei arayot, that are, right, prohibitions of arayot that are by rabbinic law, we're going to call them mitzvot? Well, shem mitzvah lishmo l'divrei chachamim, because it's a commandment to follow what the rabbis say. And that's why we call it mitzvah, isurei mitzvah. What is isur kedusha? Almana l'kohen gadol, grusha v'chalutza l'kohen idiot. Isur kedusha are what we just called chayve lavim. Anything that's a negative commandment but doesn't have a death penalty associated with it. That would be a widow to the high priest and a divorcee or a woman who underwent chalitza if she marries a kohen, which she's not allowed to. So both those situations, if let's say this woman who is married to a man and the man dies without children, she's supposed to do yibum with her brother-in-law, but he happens to be the kohen gadol and she's now a widow. Okay? So she would have to do chalitza instead of yibum with him. Now, amai karilu isur kedusha. Why are these called isur kedusha? Dichtiv, because in the commandments of the kohanim, it says kedoshim yu le'elohehem. The kohanim are on a higher level of sanctity, and therefore anything relating to a kohen, either the almanah to the kohen gadol, the grusha and chalutza to the kohen hedyot, is called isur kedusha. Okay, so far this didn't have anything to do with Rabbi Yehuda. Now, but what's clear here is the chayve lavim. There is kiddushin, right? Because otherwise, if there's no kiddushin by chayve lavim, then what would we say? She wouldn't be obligated to do yibum at all. There would be no chalitza, nothing, because it's forbidden, right? If there can be no kiddushin with them, then of course you don't do yibum. So, but this is the rabbis. This isn't Rabbi Yehuda. But Tani Allah, there's a braita on this Mishna that says Rabbi Yehuda machlif. Rabbi Yehuda swapped what's considered Isur mitzvah, what's considered Isur kedusha. So the rabbi thought Isur mitzvah was shniyot and Isur kedusha is the chayve lavim, but Rabbi Yehuda flipped it. Now notice, Rabbi Yehuda flips it, but he still thinks, doesn't matter whether you flip it or not, that's just how to define a term. But they both agree that in both those cases, the women have to do chalitza. Now, again, the Gemara is going to say this, chilufe hu demachlif, but ha chalitza baya. He swaps which one is Isur mitzvah and which one is Isur kedusha, but he still requires chalitza in both cases. And Isa kadatach Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Akiva svirale. Now, if he held like Rabbi Akiva, michti chayve lavim le Rabbi Akiva ke chayve kritut dami. Doesn't he say chayve lavim or like chayve kritut? And chayve kritut la b'nei chalitza v'yibum ninu. And this is like one of the first things you learn in Masechet Yevamot, is if you're supposed to do yibum with someone who's forbidden to you by, like if a woman falls to yibum to her father, for example, because she married her uncle, and then falls to yibum to her father, so she can't, there's no chiyuv of yibum at all. So there's no reason they would have to do chalitza. So how could it possibly be that Rabbi Yehuda holds like Rabbi Akiva, as we said? And that was how, if you remember, what were we doing? We were trying to explain this other version of Rabbi Yehuda that basically said, again, the version of Rabbi Yehuda was not like the one in our Mishnah, which we'll go back to momentarily. But the version of Rabbi Yehuda was if the mother wasn't allowed to marry the father, which we explained, chayve lavim, like a widow to a Kohen Gadol, or a grusha or chalutza to a Kohen Hedyot, then, and the son sleeps with that mother, he's not obligated, and she's because of Eshet Ab, because he slept with his father's wife. There's no double obligation there, where again, if it was all accidental, which again, a little hard to understand accidental here, but you can come up with some cases that are accidental, he didn't know it was us, or someone slept with his mother not realizing who she was, okay, he would have to bring only one sin offering because they're not considered married, because Chayve Lavim are not considered marriage, right? The marriage is not valid according to Rabbi Akiva. But if that's what Rabbi Yehuda is saying, Rabbi Yehuda here seems to think Chayve Lavim, there is kiddushin, because here you're going to have a chiyuv chalitza, which if there was no obligation, if it was for the marriage could never happen with her and the brother, there'd actually be no obligation to do levirate marriage, yibum. So how do we explain this? Gemara is going to answer it pretty simply. We're going to say when Rabbi Yehuda is speaking here and he flips what's Isur Mitzvah, what's Isur Kedusha, what he's basically saying is Lidvarav de Tanakama Ka'amar v'leilo svirale. He was only speaking according to Tanakama's view. Tanakama defined everything like this, and he said, I think you got your definition wrong. I actually don't hold like you. I don't think it's true that she has to do chalitza in the Chayve Lavim case, but that's irrelevant to the discussion. The discussion between Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis in that case in Yavamo was what's Isur Kedusha and what's Isur Mitzvah, but not the law about them. That Rabbi Yehuda didn't agree with because, again, Rabbi Yehuda holds. Again, this is all just a possible answer. We don't know really what Rabbi Yehuda held, but the Gemara is going to assume, according to that version of Rabbi Yehuda, it seems like he really holds like Rabbi Akiva, and in which case he would actually disagree with the rabbis about this Isur, this case of an almana, the Kohen Gadol, and grusha v'chalutza l'Kohen Hedyot. If the woman falls to levirate marriage with a brother-in-law who is a Kohen Gadol and she's now a widow, right? Any case would be a widow because her husband just died. She would be a widow. She would not have to do any chalitza or anything because there would be no kiddushin if she were to actually marry him, and therefore there's no obligation of yibum. Okay, now we're going to go back to the first version of Rabbi Yehuda, though. Ki ata Rabbi Yitzchak tani keditnam. When Rabbi Yitzchak came from Israel to Babylonia, he told us that his version of the Mishnah is actually, as it said in our Mishnah, which was Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Eino chayav ela mishum ha'en bilvad. If a man sleeps with his mother, who's also his father's wife, okay, the parents are still married, and he sleeps with her, he's only liable once, even though the rabbis say you're liable twice. Again, if it's a sin offering, you only bring one sin offering as opposed to the rabbis who say you bring two. V'tamamai. Now, what is the reason for this? And for this, we're going to bring three different answers. Amar Abaye, da Amar Kra, Im Chahi. We're now going to darshan the following psukim, so I'll read them to you. You can look at them inside if you want. Vayikra chapter 18, verse 7. Ervat avicha ve'ervat imecha lo tigale. Okay, don't reveal the erva of your father or of your mother. We're going to get to what the beginning of this means soon, but right now we're only focusing on the continuation. Okay, well, I stopped a little early. Ervat avicha and ervat imecha lo tigale. Okay, don't reveal the erva of your father or your mother. Imchahi, because she's your mother, lo tigale ervata. Because she's your mother, don't reveal her nakedness. Okay, so now, imchahi, what do you see? She's your mother. Well, mishum imo atamachayvo, v'yatamachayvo mishum eshet av. This is basically telling you, don't reveal the erva of your father or your mother, meaning don't sleep with your mother, because she's your mother, meaning that's what concerns us, the fact that she's your mother, not the fact that she's your father's wife. So the Gemara doesn't like Abaye, though, because they say, but then something else doesn't make sense. If you look ahead to the next pasuk, it says, ervat eshet avicha lo tigale. The next pasuk says, don't reveal the erva of your father's wife. Now, right, because ervat avicha, right? This one is ervat imecha, this other one is ervat avicha, because the other one is obviously talking about someone who is not your mother, your father's second wife, let's say. So ervat eshet avicha lo tigale, ervat avicha, that second pasuk, mishum, if you're going to read the first pasuk the way you did, that it's because it's your mother and not because it's your father's wife, well, then the next pasuk, which says, this is because it's your father's erva, mishum eshet avatamachayvo v'iyatamachayvo mishum imo, right? That seems to be saying, only because she's married to your father and not because she's your mother. Ella, but now they're going to say something else, which is they're going to make a little jump where they're going to say a difficulty with a baya. I don't think you necessarily have to read it this way, but now they're going to say, it sounds like the first pasuk we read is saying only someone who's your mother, but not necessarily married to your father. And the second pasuk is saying only someone who's married to your father, even though she's not your mother. Now, each of those cases exclude what? Exclude the case of someone who's your mother who's married to your father. So, in other words, you could theoretically, and I think this is the way you have to say theoretically, take each pasuk and say, this is forbidden because she's your mother, and perhaps it's because she's only your mother. And the second pasuk is forbidden because she's married to your father, and perhaps she's only married to your father, but she's not your mother. So the first case excludes someone who's actually your mother who's married to your father. And the second case for sure excludes someone who's your mother who's married to your father, because it's only someone who's married to your father who's not your mother. So, Hashti imo she'eno eshet aviv mechayev, eshet aviv she'eno imo mechayev, but imo eshet aviv lo mechayev klal. In other words, we're going to say, Pasuk 1 comes to say, your mother who's not your father's wife is forbidden. They're divorced, let's say, or your father's dead. Eshet aviv she'eno imo mechayev. The father's wife who's not your mother you're obligated. But perhaps it's excluding the case, which is the most intuitive case, which is your mother, who is also your father's wife, is not going to be obligated at all. So it's hard to read the psukim the way Abai reads them because it could lead you to this conclusion. Okay, second, Vitu, and a further question against Abai. L'Rabbanan nami haktivim chahi. What are the rabbis going to say to this imchahi? If it's so clear that pasuk is saying it's because she's your mother, well, the rabbis think it's also because she's your mother and also because she's your father's wife. What are they going to do with that pasuk? Well, we'll tell you what they're going to do with that pasuk. Although we'll sort of tell you. We won't fully tell you. You'll have to wait till tomorrow. That imchahi is actually needed for some other drasha. The rabbis are going to say, oh yeah, we use it for some other drasha that we're going to get to on the next page in the name of Rav Shisha B'Reid Rav Idi. We'll get there tomorrow. Once you say that imcha is used for some other drasha according to the rabbis, well then the Rabbi Yehuda Namiya who ba'alei l'chiddur Rav Shisha B'Reid Rav Idi. Also, Rabbi Yehuda is going to have to agree that it's used for some other drasha. It doesn't seem like he disagrees with that drasha. So imchahi, for a second reason now, besides that it might lead us to some crazy, absurd conclusion that specifically if she's your mother and your father's wife, you won't even be obligated at all, which would be ridiculous. It also, those words are used for some other drasha. So Abai is out. Okay, second option. Ela Amar Rav Acha B'Reid Rav Ika. Rav Acha says in the name of the son of Rav Ika, Amar Kra Ervata. Okay, the pasuk we read said, Ervata v'chayvati mecha lo tigale imchahi. The last words, I don't even think I read them to you, were lo tigale ervata. Don't reveal her nakedness. I think I did read it. Anyway, ervata is singular. Here comes his drasha. Mishum erva achat atam achayvo, v'yatam achayvo mishum shtei ervot. You're only obligated because of ervata singular form, one erva and not two. And therefore you're only obligated one sin offering and not two sin offerings. Well, that's also going to raise a problem. Elameata, because if you remember in the Mishna, and I pointed this out when we learned it, Rabbi Yehuda doesn't disagree about the other two cases where we say that you get two, both Eshadish and, right, both because she's a married woman and also because she's your, for example, daughter-in-law. So let's go to the daughter-in-law case and let's look at the pasuk. The daughter-in-law case, even Rabbi Yehuda agreed you're going to get two. One, she's your daughter-in-law. Two, she's married. Elameata, ervat kalatcha lo tigaleh. Eshet bin chahi, let's look at the pasuk. The erva of your daughter-in-law you should not reveal. She is the wife of your son. Lo tigale ervata. Don't reveal her nakedness singular form. Now, what did we just say? Singular form means only one sin offering. But we already know, right? You get two here, and Rabbi Yehuda didn't disagree with that. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Hachanami mishum erva achad atamachayvo v'yatamachayvo mishum shtei ervot. Again, there you're going to say there's only one obligation. But Hatznan, it says in our Mishnah, Habal kalato chayav alem mishum kalato umishum eshadish bein b'chayei beno bein lachar mitat beno below palig Rabbi Yehuda. But in the Mishnah, it says it without Rabbi Yehuda arguing that someone sleeps with his daughter-in-law, you're liable too, both because she's a married woman and because she's your daughter-in-law, right? And then we had that's not really important, whether he's alive, whether he's not alive, because again, if he's not alive, there's only one. She's no longer a married woman. But either way, what do you see? He holds, even though it says ervata, it means double. So you can't say ervata in our pasuk means only one because it doesn't hold true in that other situation. Ella kevan dechad gufahu avagav detrei surini nuktiv ervata. Why does it say ervata, her nakedness in singular form? Because she's one person. There might be one person who has two obligations upon her, right? Because she's both a married woman and she's your daughter-in-law. Hachanami will say the same thing by the mother. Chad gufahu, it's one person, and that's why it says ervata. Afagav detrei isurini, even though she's forbidden for two reasons, and yektiv ervata. So ervata can't be the word that's going to prove everything. So comes Rava. Ella Amar Rava. So we've knocked out Abai, who wanted to learn it from imchahi, specifically on those words, both because it could lead us to an absurd conclusion and because that's actually used for some other drasha, which we're going to get to tomorrow. And we've rejected Rav Acha, Bered Rav Ika, and Ervata because it doesn't hold true in the Kala case. So now we have Rava. We're going to keep his drasha. It's a little bit confusing though. Kasava Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds like this. Now we're going to go back to this pasuk that we've been reading since the beginning. Here, ervat avicha ve'ervat imecha lo tikale imcha hi lo tikale ervata. Now, some people think that ervat avicha, the simple reading could mean don't sleep with your father in a male homosexual relationship. So the drasha of Rabbi Yehuda is no, that's not what it means. Ervat avicha zo eshet avicha. Ervat avicha means don't reveal your father's erva, meaning by sleeping with his wife. Umaytela b'gezeira shava, and how does he learn that? From a gezeira shava, that we're going to get to on the next page, where he gets that from. Umashma bein eshet aviv shehi imo, bein eshet aviv she'eno imo. Now, when you say avicha in that first pasuk, we think this means both the woman who's married to your father and the woman who's your mother. In other words, it would include both those cases: a woman who's married to your father but not your mother, and a woman who's right bein eshet aviv shehi imo. Right? Whether she's married to your father or not your mother, or she's married to your father and is your mother. But what if she's your mother, but she's not married to your father? That wouldn't appear in those words because it's ervat avicha. Now she's no longer married to your father. So where would you get that? Talmud lamar ervat imcha lo tigale imchahi. So now they say, well, then it says ervat imecha lo tigale. Imecha means your mother, even if she's not married to your father. And then it says imchahi. Now, what does the imchahi come to say? Mishum imo atamachayvo v'iatamachayvo mishum eshet aviv. Now, what this is basically saying is like this. In the beginning, when it said avicha, we thought this meant both one who's married to your father and, right, both your mother who's married to your father and someone who's not married to your, someone who's married to your father but not your mother. Then we said, but wait, because it says Ravati Mecha, that teaches you specifically your mother, right, who's not married to your father, which is the one case that wasn't included in Ervat Avicha. But when it says Imchagi, it seems to include then your mother specifically, only your mother who's married to your father. So that pasuk is coming to tell you specifically that we're talking about that when it's your mother who's also married to your father, you're only liable because of your mother, and you're not liable because of your father. Okay, and that's how Rabbi gets this drasha, because he basically says that the pasuk is, there's a very good, it's a bit of a confusing drasha, excellent footnote in the Schottenstein here, which explains it very well. So I just want to look through there and go through with you. The way he says it is, there's three parts to this pasuk. There's ervat avicha, right? Don't reveal your father's erva, which is your father's wife, which at first we think it means your father's wife, either which way, your mother or not your mother. But then when we go further on, we realize that that's not the case. And that's what they're basically going to say. So the second part comes to say imecha, meaning your mother who's not married to your father. And the third part where it says imchahi, which basically goes back to mention something that we already kind of know, must be coming to talk about someone who sleeps with the father's wife, who's also the mother, which we now say wasn't really in the first part of the pasuk because it's mentioned here. So the first part is your father's wife who's not your mother. The second part is your mother who's not your father's wife. And the third part is your mother who's also your father's wife, but it's imcha, and it's only you're obligated for the mother and not for anything else. And that's how we understand that pasuk. And we finally found a source for Rabbi Yehuda. So what we did in today's daf to review is we started with the source for the chenek for Eshet Ish. We saw the two, Rabbi Yoshai, Rabbi Yonatan. We went back over that. We saw some questions on each of the opinions. We resolved them. Then we had a question, do we learn the whole thing of the niskalim from demaihem bam or mot yumatu? And then we had to say, what was the issue if we learned it from mot yumatu? Right? We said we learned it from demaihem bam, but why was Rabbi Zera concerned if we learned it from mot yumatu? Which we then said maybe all the niskalim really we would have learned from the chenek case. And then we got to who are the niskalim, and from there we really focused only on Rabbi Yehuda. Number one, we saw a different version of Rabbi Yehuda, which had to do with this other issue of if the mother couldn't have married the father, even though they think they're married, they're not really married, and you won't be liable mishum eshet av, eshet av. Then we went back to the first version of Rabbi Yehuda, and then we tried to explain what the source for that was. We had 3 attempts till we finally got the third one, which we were able to explain it, even though it was a bit of a confusing drasha. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavua Tov.